A stone may determine the course of a river. He was that stone at this horrible moment, which had become the center of the whole universe.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 13. Perelandra, Chapter 11. Let's get ready to rumble. Let's get ready to rumble! Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favorite C.S. Lewis podcast run by two Thulkandrians, Andrew and David. This season, we're once again following the adventures of Elwyn Ransom.
Sorry, David. We're three Thulkandrians again.
No, who this time is exploring Perelandra, and today Ransom makes a decision about what he has to do. And today we're joined by a special guest, a former co-host of the show, Mr. Matt Bush.
Oh,
Matthew, since our listeners won't know who you are unless they've got a very good memory, would you mind introducing yourself?
Gentlemen, you could not resist. I mean, I stepped away, everything fell apart, and you invited me back. I mean, I don't really know how else to phrase this. It's good to be back.
Just as a guest.
It's good.
Provisional.
You'll have to earn your keep.
Oh, it's good to be back.
We need some more Matthean malapropisms.
Wow, that's a t-shirt.
But what we don't realize is, as Lewis said, sometimes a third person brings out the best in the other two.
Ah, yes. Now that Charles is gone, I don't have more of Ronald. I have less of him.
Yeah, you guys noticed that last week.
Wait, you weren't here? So, Matthew, please explain your absence, other than that you think you're better than the rest of us.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it was, as everyone knows, we were recording these over the holidays, and just logistical challenges popped up, mainly due to the fact that Notre Dame made the playoff game. And so we would have been able to do the Friday, but it was not only did it make the playoff game, but it was at Notre Dame. I was already in Chicago with her family. So Mary Margaret, myself, were able to get tickets for her parents, us, and her brothers. And so we drove down in the morning and spent the afternoon down at Notre Dame. We toured her dad's office. So long story short, we were unable to figure out another time because you can imagine all around Christmas, dates really start to pack up. So I blew the date that was scheduled, and we were not able to find a second one due to logistical challenges. Notre Dame won. As we record, they're playing tonight against Georgia. So let's say a Hail Mary for the University of Our Lady to come through. And I'm excited.
And how about you, Andrew? Did you have a good birthday?
Had a wonderful birthday. Thank you. Yeah, my wife's family, all 24 of us. One of us had to stay behind to work, but 24 of the 25, including 8 children, 7 or younger, who love running around the house. We rented a cabin in Tennessee and all drove up to Sevierville, Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg area, and had a wonderful 4 days cooking and taking hikes, and spent a lot of time out on the porch in the cool weather, smoking my pipe and reading a book and playing games. We love playing games with each other. And that day was really good. Got a birthday cake and had a little get together. The only drawback, my friend Michael O'Peasy, who I met at the Davenant Institute, and who will be the academic director of the C.S. Lewis conference that we have here in May. Michael and his family were 45 minutes away. We were going to get together for my birthday lunch, but the whole family fell sick. Didn't get to see them, but we'll trust that further up and further in, we'll get a chance to do that. So yeah, thanks for asking. And I'm starting my 59th year, so thinking a lot about what the next birthday looks like.
Wonderful. Well, I'm switching to Athletic Brewing today. I think you guys are still on Best Day Brewing. But once you guys have finished that, I am getting you guys a case of this stuff because it is also really, really good, including dark beers, which is what I'm drinking
fantastic.
today.
I have heard Athletic Brewing is like booming. They're kind of in the private markets doing fundraising rounds and did like a 50 million fundraising rounds, standing at almost $1 billion valuation. I love this. I love just kind of hearing about a startup doing more of a traditional tech path, but doing it in an innovative way, right at the beginning of a non-alcoholic wave. Like, it's kind of brilliant, blunt.
Well, Chris Reiser, one of our patron supporters and slackers, he's been pushing Athletic on me. And Chris, you're absolutely right. Very, very good.
I'm excited about this.
I won't mention any names, but I tried ordering from one of the homebrew companies, a big popular one, And I think on Black Friday, ordered, the color that I wanted for the keg. And the only beer that I was interested in that they had was a bitter. And then I got notice. I emailed them weeks later saying, hey, what's the deal? Oh, we're sorry. We're out of that color and we're out of that beer. So you'll have to wait. And so I waited. And then they said, oh, I'm sorry, we're out of that beer and you'll have to wait. And I waited. And then they said, oh, I'm sorry, we're out of that beer. Here's 2 packs of our favorite IPA. And I don't like IPA. The only reason I ordered it was for the British bitter. And so I fumed and fussed and said, you've lost a customer. So now I am looking for a good, fairly easy homebrew situation where I can have fresh bitter beer whenever I want it.
What are you two drinking today instead?
I'm drinking coffee. It's cold here.
Boo. Well, he's failing. How about you, Matt?
I am doing the Best Day Brewing. I'm doing the Kolsch style.
Lovely, refreshing. It's a really nice beer to have in the mornings. And I don't normally get to say that.
This is why you brought me back, David. I mean, Andrew's sitting here slacking. I mean, I really don't know how to say it.
Yeah, well, it's the 8th or 9th day of Christmas, so I'm drinking coffee out of my Christmas mug still.
I love it.
Speaking of the 12 days of Christmas, I actually posted on our blog, I'll be sending it out in this month's newsletter. It's the setting of Tolkien's Noel poem that has been put to music. And I posted it on the blog on the 5th day of Christmas, since, it's a day celebrated with rings, and that seemed to be a good day to share Tolkien's hymn.
Well, and also tomorrow, as we record this, we're recording on the 2nd of January. Tomorrow is the day that everybody toasts the professor. It's his birthday. So a day early to the professor.
The professor.
The professor. And more importantly, to our new Patreon supporter, Mike Smith.
Yay!
This is true. Tolkien has never supported us on Patreon.
Nope.
Mike
That's
Smith
true.
has.
Nope. Tolkien is below the top tier Patreon supporters. Well, Mike, we raise a glass to you and for your generosity. And most importantly, as the Lord uses you in his grand scheme as he uses Ransom, when it calls for spiritual attacks, may you rise up and fight the spiritual attacks. When it calls for a physical punch every once in a while, may you rise up and feel that calling. Cheers.
Cheers.
To violence. Cheers.
To violence.
Appropriate violence instituted by God.
I'm reading a fantastic book called The Fourth Wing. It's just like Red Rising. It's in that Name of the Wind. It's all of that incredible Aragon. Anyways, the lead character's name is Violet and her nickname is Violence. So it made me think of that.
Well, and I'm reading Alan Jacobs. So there's a series of books called Biographies of Great Religious Books. I've read the Mere Christianity volume, and so it intrigued me. I'm like, what other great religious books have biographies? And Alan Jacobs, who wrote the Narnian, the kind of the intellectual biography of C.S. Lewis, wrote a biography of the Book of Common Prayer, which is my handbook. They have ones for the Quran and for Revelation and for Milton. So loads of interesting, the Talmud, loads of interesting things. But this was part of what I was doing every morning, smoking my pipe on the porch as the sun rose and the air was cool and reading a book about a book.
Well, for sharing books, I'm currently reading Why Literature Still Matters by Jason M. Baxter, and it is wonderful. He'll be on the show. I'm going to be talking to him about it.
Lovely.
But let's talk about Perelandra. And this is my 100-word summary of Chapter 11. Ransom realizes that unless the temptations end, the lady will eventually be worn down. He laments Maleldil's apparent absence, but realizes he's been present throughout and has sent Ransom as his representative. There is an argument between Ransom, another voice in his head, his voluble self, and even the darkness, which seems to have a voice of its own. Ransom begins to consider whether he is meant to engage the unman in physical combat. He finally accepts his role in the salvation of Perelandra, and Maleldil casts a deep sleep over all nearby, and then sends Ransom to bed.
This is Pints with Jack season. No, I'm just kidding.
So, it's after dark when we begin this chapter. The unman is waiting for Ransom to fall asleep, so he can wake up the Green Lady and talk to her without interference. And we're told that for the third time, more strongly than ever, it came into Ransom's head, this can't go on. And we're told that the enemy was using third-degree methods, which refers to techniques of, interrogation or questioning that involve coercion, psychological pressure. What's Ransom's chief fear here?
I mean, ultimately, if you take a step back, it's been a few episodes, in our case, chapters, where it just feels like a back and forth. And he can do a little bit, but then the enemy just comes back. And not only has it been just a repeat game, Ransom has sensed his, call it humanity, and it seems to him that the enemy is doing a lot more with Weston. So it's like, not only is this a repeat game, but I don't feel like I'm getting the support that Weston is getting. And so he just kind of, I think, extrapolated forward. And as you extrapolate your current circumstances forward, it seems, unfortunately, pretty dire to him.
Both dire and also kind of lamentable and sad. He's like, oh, well, I wonder when the miracle is coming. I mean, granted, I've read this chapter a number of times before, but never before have I been so, dude, you're an idiot. When are you going to get it? But he just almost a defeatist. Oh, well, when is the miracle coming? I don't see a miracle. It's not fair. Oh, well, God will God will eventually have to do something about this, almost like a spectator, and doesn't seem to get that he might perhaps play a role.
He's really concerned that if things keep up at this rate, the lady's going to be worn down and he's going to lose. Mm-hmm. As you say, Andrew, he's just complaining. He's like, well, the side of evil seems to get their miracle. The unman appears. What's the side of Maleldil going to do?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He asks that question that everybody will ask when they suffer. It's like, God, where are you? And it's then that he realizes that Maleldil has been present throughout.
Yeah.
It's only that he has been subconsciously suppressing that weight that he had felt earlier for a few days. He had not been practicing the presence of God.
The book says, while he was thinking this, as suddenly and sharply as if the solid darkness about him had spoken with articulate voice, he knew that Maleldil was not absent. That sense, so very welcome, yet never welcomed without the overcoming of a certain resistance, that sense of the presence which he had once or twice before experienced on Perelandra returned to him. The darkness was packed quite full. It seemed to press upon his trunk. And so, yes, sometimes the darkness, when it feels like absence, is the darkness of God, there. And we know, of course, from Psalm 97 that clouds and thick darkness surround him. And so God can be expressed or expressive in the midst of darkness. Frederick Buechner says, God's never gone. It's just men go blind. And so in the darkness, he begins to feel the presence of something really important.
And the way it's described, it seemed to press upon his trunk so that he could hardly use his lungs. It seemed to close in on his skull like a crown of intolerable weight. I immediately thought it's the weight of glory.
Yes.
It's been there throughout.
Yes, absolutely.
I immediately thought of Henry Nouwen too. The way that he talks about the voice of God is very hard to hear over the loud clanging gongs of the world. And so if you want to be able to hear that, silent, stillness, and solitude, the 3 S's are just so incredibly important. And I was thinking also of just our Lewisian concept that we've talked about many times before. But that idea that holding on into the light or into darkness, which you once knew to be true into light, it's like, Andrew, you alluded to it earlier when you said, oh, come on, man. Can't he look in his past and see the various moments where God came after he would have thought? And so we saw that in the previous book. He questioned, he doubted, he stepped up. I mean, it's amazing how our brain kind of tells ourselves, well, I know he did in the past, but this time it's a little different. This time it's a little bit more challenging. This time there's a little bit more going on.
It's like that gospel chorus, won't he do it, right? And when I stop and think about my past and think about all the things that God has saved me from and things where I thought the situation was terrible and God really was planning something good. I'm, as I've mentioned before, I'm at a time of uncertainty. We don't know where we're going to end up after June or perhaps sooner. And the temptation is to think, oh, well, God has completely forgotten about me this time and doesn't care and all the rest. And in reality, he is hurrying behind the scenes to do whatever he needs to do to help, and also counting on me to do my part, to be faithful to what I have in front of me today. And there's certainly plenty of that, isn't there?
Yes.
And in this next section, we're almost introduced to a new character. It's described as Ransom's voluble critic, or his voluble self. It's this chattering that goes on in his brain, sort of responding to all of the overtures of Maleldil. Because now Ransom realizes that Maleldil is not only present, he's always been present. And this other voice in his head saying, well, that sort of presence is all very well, but the enemy is here, saying and doing things. Where is Maleldil's representative? I love this section of the text because we don't actually hear the direct answer, but we can infer it from what follows. Mm-hmm. Where is Maleldil's representative?
He is him. I mean, ultimately, that is his representative.
But it's his reaction to it, because we're told that this comes back like a tennis player or a fencer's riposte. But it says it almost seems blasphemous.
The danger is always to think too much or too little of ourselves, and not to see ourselves as, like you mentioned, a weight of glory. A glory or a terror or a horror. And we are on our way to being eternal glories. And should we not lean into that? I also was struck by the word voluble, his voluble critic. And voluble, of course, it's related to volume, but it also means to revolve. And so it means to talk incessantly. And so he's got his internal critic who won't stop saying all of these things, and it reminds me of Weston, right? Weston is voluble. He's talking incessantly, and the enemy will also talk incessantly. We'll try to put things in our head or keep things from our head and won't stop until we realize that it's his voice behind what we think and call him on it and then move on. And so, yeah, I thought voluble was interesting.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like you have not only the unman and Ransom, it's also you got one of Screwtape's lieutenants hanging around near Ransom as well. Absolutely. Saying, what can I do? I've done all I can. I've talked, I'm sick of it. It's no good, I tell you. And the text says, the suggestion was, he argued, itself diabolical, a temptation to fatuous pride, to megalomania.
Yes.
And this was actually touched on right back at the beginning of the book when Ransom and Lewis were talking about the role that they were going to play in Perelandra.
Well, and it forces him really to kind of consider what he's doing there, why he has been called there. He isn't a tourist. He's called for a specific purpose. And it begins to dawn on him that now he's forced to perceive, as the book says, that his own coming to Perelandra was at least as much of a marvel as the enemy's. That miracle on the right side, which he had demanded, had in fact occurred. He himself was the miracle. And I think that that's a healthy way to think of ourselves in the proper spiritual context. We may be the person to offer a word of comfort, a word of encouragement, even a word of rebuke. And the role that we play, however quietly, our prayers silently in our own room without going out or speaking to anybody all day, those prayers may be the turning point of the whole world. And I think that Lewis does a good job at kind of showing that to us.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, he does a good job showing this, and we see this, but then also he does a great job of right, he has this realization, which seems like, oh, boom, he's good to go. But then the rest of this chapter, as we're obviously going to unpack, is a bit of a back and forth. Well, that's a great thought. Well, here comes all the negative thoughts. Well, then, another good thought that combats the negative thoughts. Well, then a whole flood of negative thoughts again, which I think as we go through this, many of us listeners are going to relate to in our own spiritual journeys.
It's funny that both the Green Lady and the Unman don't say anything in this chapter, yet there is a full conversation that goes on throughout, all inside Ransom's head. And even though he realizes that he is the miracle, he regards himself as a pretty pathetic miracle. He's this comic figure, ridiculously half sunburnt man who has also constantly been defeated in argument. But then he sees an out. He thinks of something which gives him comfort. What is it?
Well, he starts to have this thought that, if he's part of the miracle, this is going to end up coming back to Maleldil. So this is a very Lewisian theme. I actually used to do this with my professional life a lot. Your job is to do the best you can, but you leave the rest up to God. Effectively, this is the fiction version of that.
Which sounds very pious.
Yeah.
But that's not how this goes.
Right. And he says, oh, well, as long as I try to and do my best, and just kind of leaves it up to everybody else. It's kind of like when you get on an elevator, everybody assumes someone else is in charge.
Yeah.
I saw that again and again in leadership. When you walk into a room and somebody speaks authoritatively, you're going to assume that they're in charge and that you're not. And trying one's best. And as we learned from Horse and His Boy, perhaps you can run just a little faster, perhaps you can do a little bit more, and so he's struggling through this. Although I'm a little infuriated at Ransom, I'm sure that's because I read it so often. And these struggles are our own, right? I have a list of things to do today that if I don't do them, won't get done. And maybe the height of courage, maybe my struggle against the unman is this tedious list. But those are lists of important things that need doing. And so, his whole process, he certainly understands the human psyche well, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I did appreciate too, at one point in here, he's like, well, I did my best. I could go back and if it doesn't work out, I can apologize and go to confession and get God's forgiveness and mercy. Really bit of a dangerous train of thought, to be honest.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. He keeps trying to find ways out. So it begins with I'll just do my best. And Maleldil probably only wants me here just to observe what happens so I can report back to
tell
Earth.
everybody about it. Yeah.
Exactly. I thought of the amazing movie, The Rock, where Sean Connery says, losers are always whining about their best. And the text says his journey to Perelandra was not a moral exercise, nor a sham fight. If the issue lay in Maleldil's hands, Ransom and the lady were those hands. The fate of a world really depended on how they behaved in the next few hours.
Yeah.
The thing was irreducibly, nakedly real. They could, if they chose, decline to save the innocence of this new race, and if they declined its innocence, would not be saved. It rested with no other creature in all time or all space. This he saw clearly, though as yet he had no inkling of what he could do.
Yeah.
At first, I actually put a question mark because I was going to ask you guys your thoughts on this. Obviously, I hadn't gotten to the end of the chapter where effectively we realized this was just a really bad thought. And he actually does answer this, because my first thought was going to be like, do you guys agree with this? Like, I can singularly rest on a singular person. This seems pretty. But as we're going to see, there is a solution and an answer to this, which I guess I'll note now and we'll come back to later.
Well, and also, Matt, it's a concept that perhaps you might want to explore in the new year. This is theosis. This is him being God's representative on earth, right? What would have happened to our world if, and I know that would have beens are not given to us. But
Aslan is growling at you, Andrew.
I know. But if there were a Christian representative there in the garden, right, to help. And so we'll get into that in a moment. But he is God's representative in that place. And he's part of the body of Christ. And as that part, he occupies a part that no one else can occupy. And in the same way, I think that maybe all of our existence is, I don't know, what's the adjective? Theotic, theosistic, and we are that spot right there. So
I am loving this because I was at a Byzantine. We didn't talk about this in the beginning. I'm not going to go on a side tangent here, but at some point I would love to chat. I was at a Byzantine Catholic Rite church and they gave a tour and talked about the icons and everything. And honestly, I texted David and I sent him some pictures. I was like, man, I've never really studied different liturgies, but I was drawn to that. I was in there. It drew you up to the divine worship and stuff. And I guess I share that. The reason that connects to theosis is because I text David. I'm like, what should I talk to the priest about? He goes, theosis.
It's always safe. If ever you're talking to an Eastern priest, talk about theosis. They'll be very happy.
Wait, you were in front of all those icons and you didn't text me?
I know. That was really bad, actually. My bad, Andrew. I panicked. Honestly, my first thought wasn't that. It was just like, oh, David goes to Byzantine Catholic. And
yeah, my wife got me an icon for my birthday, for Christmas, another Marian child icon. And so, yeah, I think I've got now 9 different icons that have the Blessed Mother in them.
He paints them. And this is what I painted, by the way, Andrew.
He writes them.
Well, no, you can say paint.
Okay.
I don't get precious about that.
But I like that is a good distinction for those that don't know. Like me.
Back to Perelandra. It is kind of funny when Ransom realizes, like, oh, this really rests on me. And he says, did Maleldil want to lose worlds? It's like, why on earth are you deputizing me to do this? It's like, I'm going to do a horrible job. But he does try and think about what's happening back on Earth. because they're in the midst of World War II, and young men barely old enough to shave, or maybe just have the same genetics as Matthew, they are now sort of entering the breach. A great weight is placed on them. The results of their actions are going to have far-reaching consequences as well.
Mm-hmm.
So he tries one final escape.
Well, and as he compares himself, we can hear echoes of his own war experience. At one point, he took a whole company of German soldiers, or a detachment of them. You know, the shells are flying above his head. This struggle that Ransom went through is the struggle that he went through as a soldier, and probably Warney as well. So I wonder if there isn't kind of some of that sticking around.
Ransom then has a wonderful thought. He sees a way out because he suddenly realizes he doesn't even know what he could do. He says all this horror being premature. No definite task was before him.
Mm-hmm.
All he had to do was, what he could do. And we're told a mild flood of what appeared to him cheerful and rational piety rose and engulfed him. He was like, I don't know what to do, so I'm probably okay. But then Ransom, he sort of stumbles into a thought, and it kind of rocks his world.
He thinks that maybe because this is a spiritual struggle, it should only be spiritual. He shouldn't have to be physical about it. It shouldn't have to resort to fisticuffs. Thinks maybe it's childish and savage to think that he should actually physically try to put a violent stop to the unman. And, the text says, vivid pictures crowded upon him, the deadly cold of those hands. He had touched the creature accidentally some hours before. The long metallic nails ripping off narrow strips of flesh, pulling out tendons. One would die slowly. And so he's thinking about the actual physical contact, and it's horrifying to him. But that may actually be the way that it has to go.
I do love how he comes full circle on this, just like he came full circle on the thing I mentioned earlier that we'll circle back to, put a pin in this one as well. And just the way I actually underlined it is one of the more brilliant comments in the entire book. And again, I'm just going to tease it there, but we'll circle back to this in 20 minutes.
Well, Andrew, you mentioned some of the key words that he uses to push back on this: childish, savage, and he also calls them a materialistic or crude. The idea that fighting evil might involve anything physical.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it would degrade the spiritual warfare to the condition of mere mythology. But then he has to check himself, because this has been one of the things that he's been learning while he's been there. The line between truth and mythology might not have been what he thought. And in a passage that I'm sure Charlie Starr makes great hay from, he realizes that there's a different relationship between truth, myth, and fact than he realized. And this made me think of exorcisms, because exorcisms are a spiritual act, but they involve physical things: oil, water, words, crucifixes. All of these things are part and parcel of fighting evil. It's not quite in the same way that Ransom's going to be doing it, but it shows that it's not almost Gnostic. It's spiritual, as in divorced from all physicality.
Yeah, well, and it brings in Lewis's point in this chapter that some of the importance of Fulcandra, of our planet, was this was the planet where God, who inhabited all of the universe and was spirit, became a physical creature small enough to fit into a feeding trough, right? And so now the physicality and the spirituality are indelibly connected. And because of that, like the text says, even on earth, the sacraments existed as a permanent reminder that the division between spirit and flesh was neither wholesome nor final. And that's part of why I'm a liturgical Christian now, is because although I wasn't raised anything and my early training was evangelical, which I still treasure, but the idea that the sacraments have final spiritual sense to them, carry some kind of eternal weight, that physicality and spirituality can meet, and they meet in the incarnation and they meet in the sacraments. Last night, my wife and I had a fire pit. We bought a fire pit over a year ago, and we finally pulled it out, and we just had our second one last night. As the logs were burning down, I took some incense from my stash and put nard and frankincense and myrrh on the logs. And, in some ways to say this connection of this very physical thing of a fire and the spiritual essence of, smoke like prayer rising before him. These two things are connected, and wanted to at least mark the beginning of the year with a physical thing that had spiritual overtones. And that's what we see here too.
Now, Ransom's voluble self, this other voice in his head, actually brings up a pretty good argument. If the lady were to be kept in obedience only by the forceful removal of the tempter, so what Ransom is starting to think he might actually have to do, what use is it, and what would it prove? And if the temptation were not proving or testing, why would it be allowed to happen at all? Basically, he says, did Maleldil suggest that our own world might have been saved if the elephant had accidentally trodden on the serpent a moment before Eve was about to yield? Was it as easy and as unmoral as that? The thing was patently absurd.
Mm-hmm.
But that is a really interesting question. It's like, if this is a testing of the Green Lady, what do you actually prove by the simple removal of that temptation?
Yeah, well, the elephant is an absurd example because the elephant didn't have a moral or willful part to play. And this is not an accident that Ransom was brought there. And so this is the conclusion he's coming to.
What are your thoughts on that? Like, if you just kind of go down this train of thought for a second. I mean, I guess there's no point in having this thought. Sure, this one, the same way this Perelandra could be different than Tellus or Earth. I mean, it could just be different. I guess the short answer is it could have been, but it wasn't. And another one could do it differently.
I think that's where we're going to go. But when I was thinking how I would respond to that challenge, it's like, how is this a temptation if all you're doing is solving it by removing the temptation? It actually makes me think of my own struggles with sin, that very often the larger, and I'm going to be honest, the far more successful way of resisting temptation is removing that temptation from me.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
In our theology, we would often call them a near occasion of sin. It's like,
what
are you doing in that area?
Yep.
This isn't going to end well.
Yeah.
You need to separate these two now.
Right. And, it's a good time of the year to begin to think through the next year and to put some physical separation in.
Yeah. Even modern day psychology has started to show this. I remember coming across some sort of academic paper or essay that was just talking about willpower is to some degree sort of a myth, at least in the sense that we think of the strictest version of it. And what you just described, David, plays a huge role. People that have the best success with habits, it's a lot more to do with the decision they make to not put themselves in the position to be there. So if you want to eat healthy or you want to do like no alcohol for a period, don't have it in your place. If you want to not look at social media, take it off your phone and lock it. You just won't. So the singular decision can make a big decision. They weren't trying to say it's 100% that, obviously, but that plays a lot bigger role than keeping it in front of you or having everything and trying to willpower it every single day.
Yeah, I just spent 4 days with, like I said, a number of toddlers, and there's lots of temptations everywhere. Here's that puzzle that we're working on. Here's this table that you shouldn't stand on. Let's remove the temptations from them. Let's remove the edges let's put the table that has the sharp edges where they're running. Let's put that table somewhere else. And let's remove what we can to make it easier on them. It's a lot easier to remove or to supply an alternate. If they're going to go mess up the puzzle that the adults are working on, why don't I give them a puzzle of their own? And so remove the temptations, offer a healthy alternative rather than trying to teach them the discipline of not doing it. No, don't do that. And reasoning with them is not going to work nearly as well as, here's this alternative. Let's play this game. They were screaming. They were making noise as children do. They were not ill-behaved. And the rest of us were trying to have a conversation. So Kristen went over and played the dance stop game. So let's dance. Okay, now stop and be really silent, and they were enthralled, and it got us a few moments. And so that she offered an alternative, and that's pretty healthy spiritual advice as well, I think.
So I do think that's one element of it. But in the text, what it focuses on is Ransom's misconception about the relationship between Eden and Perelandra. And he realizes that the incarnation on Thalcandra, on Earth, changed everything. Yes. Humans have been incorporated into Maleldil's mystical body. And the text says, when Eve fell, God was not man. He had not yet made men members of his body. Since then he had, and through them henceforth he would save and suffer. One of the purposes for which he had done all this was to save Perelandra, not through himself, but through himself in ransom.
Right. And fill in your own name here.
Yeah. And this is, I feel the same thing as ransom. This seems blasphemous, but it's very biblical. Very biblical.
If we really are the body of Christ, we are his particular representation in our relationship, in our home, in the grocery store, wherever we find ourselves. And that's part of what, the joining of God with man in the person of Christ has done.
And at the end of this section, Ransom asks the questions that make Aslan growl. What if? And he starts wondering about the fall in Genesis, because we get a very terse account of what happened. And he asks, he did not know whether Eve had resisted at all, or if so, for how long. Still less did he know how the story would have ended if she had. If the serpent had been foiled and returned the next day and the next, what then? Would the trial have lasted forever? How would Maleldil have stopped it? The darkness, capital D, has been responding throughout this conversation, but it offers no answer here about these hypothetical alternatives. And we keep alluding to Aslan growling, because whenever anyone asks Aslan what would have happened, with one exception, he typically growls at them and just tells them it's not for you to know. But it's very clear from the darkness that Maleldil, as we learned in Screwtape, Maleldil wants him to focus on the present. Patiently and inexorably, it brought him back to the here and now, and to the growing certainty of what here and now demanded. Here, in Perelandra, the temptation would be stopped by ransom, or it would not be stopped at all.
So good. He understands his own position so well. And I think that maybe with the war going on, it brought it back to mind. And he's also, I think, perhaps thinking about Warney, who is serving his last term in the war. And, if it's up to Warney, wherever he is, and it's up to each of us.
So he's starting to realize that he's going to have to fight the unman. But his voluble self, his internal critic, offers one last-ditch attempt at getting him out of this. What is it, Matt?
He starts to wonder if he can obviously attack it and kill it. And so his first question is if it's even possible. But then he transitions to, which I thought was really, really powerful. This is one of the things that really stuck out to me in this chapter was Weston's body could be destroyed. So he realizes this. And presumably that body was the enemy's only foothold in Perelandra. By that body, when that body still obeyed a human will, it had entered the new world. Expelled from it, it would doubtless have no other habitation. This stuck out to me because it does go to show, and we're going to have a little bit more that's going to be really brilliant coming up after this, so I don't want to get ahead of myself, but evil does need to enter in through the openness and acceptance of humans. And so in the same degree that we can, well, one, first of all, it's important for us to know that we don't want to be that conduit. So let's start with step one as humans. But then I really thought that it was powerful that we can be like Ransom in everyday life and recognize the role that we can play in thwarting evil as it comes our way. Like maybe if we stop this one thing, yeah, it could pop up in a different manifestation, but in that instance, it's a powerful thing to stop it. So I really like this. I started like double time because I guess where I'm going with all this, it gives you a sense of agency. It makes you feel like you can be a part of something. In the beginning, he has this incredible self-doubt that he can't do anything. Now he's starting to realize he actually could do something. He's not doing it in an arrogant way where it's like, oh man, this is all me, but it's just, yeah, I don't know. This really stuck out to me.
Well, and, he realizes that he's not fighting the great Satan. He's fighting, if it's a physical fight, he's fighting against another physical body, and a physical body not all that unlike his own. A sedentary scholar is what the text says, and he's a sedentary scholar too. So it's like, okay, well, maybe it's not that unfair a match.
But he does question himself. He does doubt himself. When did I ever win a fight all my life? And this is actually a World War I veteran. And Ransom, he tries to remind himself that young men, again, at this moment on Earth are laying down their lives for actually a far lesser cause than the salvation of an entire planet. But interestingly, he can't shame himself into action. And he thinks that he could face the young man if either of them were just armed with guns. But it seems to be the idea of grappling with him that really bothers him.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when he fantasizes about what Matt mentioned earlier, about disobeying and repenting later, just like St. Peter. But then inexplicably, his mood changes and he thinks about fighting and possibly even winning, and even without any serious injury. But although the text says, but no faintest hint of a guarantee in that direction came to him from the darkness. The future was black as night itself.
Yes. But you don't understand what you might be able to do until you actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's what's facing him, and that's what he actually faces.
And now we get to the question of Ransom's name. Because the voice in the darkness says something which takes things in a new direction. It says, "It is not for nothing that you are called Ransom." And we're told that the etymology of Ransom's surname is actually Randolph's son. And that's how he knows that he's not making this up, because he'd have never thought of this as anything more than a pun. It says, to connect the name Ransom with the act of ransoming would have been for him a mere pun. But he then starts to see this as part of some great plan. The fact that although the sort of direct connection in etymology between his surname and its origins and the idea of ransoming an individual or a planet, although they're not connected in the micro, in the macro, they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually put me in mind of the other Inklings. This seems like a little bit of Charles Williams and a little bit of Owen Barfield.
Mm-hmm.
The ideas of all of the whole being much more connected than we might think.
Yes. And there aren't any accidents. There aren't any coincidences in the universe, right? It's, if God is God, then the universe is completely connected, right? It's, you know, he is a part and parcel of everything that goes on.
And of course, here we should make mention of the seeming inconsistency, because here Ransom is speaking like Ransom is his name. But if we remember from Out of the Silent Planet, that is a pseudonym that is given to him by Lewis in order to tell Ransom, quote unquote, his story. If I squint a little bit, I can actually make this work, because it is still not for nothing that C.S. Lewis chose the pseudonym of Ransom. And, you know, as a Cambridge Don, whoever Ransom's real name is, he would have known the etymology of ransom and wouldn't have thought anything of it. But I could argue that, no, even Maleldil's hand was at work when it came to the name that Lewis chose for this person's adventures.
I can't squint that much. I think that it was thoughtlessness in Lewis and writing in haste. Like the orange marmalade, the marmalade roll in a land that has been winter for 100 years with no tropical fruit. I think that this is just an inconsistency. Although I like what he does with it at this point.
Yes. Well, the voice then says something else. It says, "My name also is Ransom." What's the significance of that?
Well, it's a representation of one of the thoughts of one of the schools of thought about the atonement. One of the theories of atonement is that the Son of Man came not to serve, not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And one of the things that happens at the crucifixion is that Christ pays our ransom. We are held hostage, and he comes and pays the ransom himself. And so this is Lewis embodying that theology. We see him doing theology kind of disguised in other phrases. He talks about the perichoresis of the Holy Trinity in mere Christianity, but unless you know the theology behind it, you won't really see that. Certainly, Jesus paid our cost, paid our penalty, and set us free. You'll have books and arguments amongst theologians about, is it Christus Victor, or is it vicarious substitutionary atonement? There's lots of different ways to look at the atonement, but my kind of simplistic way is, as much of those theories has any truth in them, take them. And certainly, you know, Christ being the ransom for all sin is certainly helpful and true.
And that word is used in the Bible several times. You quoted Mark's Gospel, and I think it's also Matthew's, where Jesus describes himself as a ransom, but also in St. Peter's first letter, he says that you are ransomed from your futile ways, inherited from your fathers. And later in this chapter, there's going to be an allusion to the book of Revelation, and we find it there as well. when all in heaven sing the song, saying, "Worthy art thou to take the scroll and to open its seals, for thou wast slain, and by thy blood didst ransom men from God, from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation." The significance of the fact that not only is Ransom's name Ransom, but Maleldil is also Ransom. He realizes that Perelandra is going to be redeemed somehow. Lewis writes, "If now he failed, this world would hereafter be redeemed. If he were not the ransom, another would be. Yet nothing was ever repeated. Not a second crucifixion, perhaps, who knows? Not even a second incarnation. Some act of even more appalling love, some glory of yet deeper humility." So there will be a redemption one way or another, but he's got the opportunity of participating in it.
Yeah.
The text says he had pitched himself till now standing before the Lord like Peter, but it was worse. He sat before him like Pilate. It lay with him to save or to spill. His hands had been reddened as all men's had been in the slaying before the foundation of the world. So it was while we were still sinners, Christ came and saved us. If he chose, he could dip them again in the same blood. "Mercy," he groaned, and then, "Lord, why me?" But there was no answer.
Mercy and Lord, he says. Good for him.
But then Ransom has an experience that he says he'd only had once or twice before. And it seems to be a sort of certainty that the thing was going to be done. It's not like anything changed. It wasn't like there was even a rational thought that he argued himself into doing it. He said it happened once during the war when he was about to do something very dangerous, and another time when he was going to go to London to make an excessively embarrassing confession. And since all of this book has been alluding to real things in Lewis's life, I'd love to know what that was in real terms. But he does something that he does in The Great Divorce. In terms of free will and predestination sort of seem to come together and become the same thing or meaningless. But whichever way you cut it, he seems to realize, oh, I am going to do this now.
Yes. Yeah. We could get off on a huge theological debate about predestination and free will, and I don't think that that's advisable.
Not particularly useful either.
The theological thought tool I would use is that although predestination and free will seem contradictory, they are not. They are paradoxical, and we don't understand because we can't think well enough. They are not contradictory in God's mind. When we get to heaven, when we finally understand on the next plane just what's going on, we'll understand, oh, this didn't make sense, but it makes perfect sense now. And so this is, I think, one of those things.
To quote Lewis's version of MacDonald in The Great Divorce, "Do not flash yourself with such questions. You cannot fully understand the relations of choice and time until you're beyond both. And you are not brought here to study such curiosities. What concerns you is the nature of the choice itself." His choice here is his real participation. The text says he could hardly remember why he'd accused himself of megalomania when this idea first occurred to him. It was true that if he left it undone, Maleldil himself would do some greater thing instead. In a sense, he stood for Maleldil, but no more than Eve would have stood for him by simply not eating the apple, or than any man stands for him in doing any good action. As there was no comparison in person, so there was none in suffering, or only such comparison as may be between a man who burns his finger, putting out a spark, and a fireman who loses his life in fighting the conflagration because that spark was not put out. So here Ransom is in a position to put out a spark that might become a raging fire that Maleldil will come and sort out later. He no longer asked, why me? It might as well be he as another. It might as well be any other choice as his. The fierce light which he had seen resting on this moment of decision rested in reality on all. So we might be armchair quarterbacking Ransom's choices here, but Lewis is saying, actually, we're all involved.
Well, this was, by the way, the part that was the second most, this last section. I mean, between the realization that you can play a role in stamping out evil to the fact that if you fail, it's going to happen either way.
Yes.
I thought it was a really beautiful dynamic, and it takes the ego off of it too. It's like, it almost becomes an invitation to participate. So one, you have the conviction that you could actually, which I think is a powerful realization, but it also can be dangerous because pride can enter. Well, the second you realize that it's going to happen either way.
Yeah.
Now it might happen in the future, someone else. then the pride is like removed. It's like, well, no, this is a gracious, humble act that you get to participate in. And if you choose to, well, it's going to be far better for yourself too, to be honest. But it's going to play out either way. I love that idea.
Well, the second stanza of Lewis's poem, Readjustment, which we think comes late in his life. And he's lamenting the fact that the ancient stories don't seem to have survived in the modern and postmodern age. And he's a little grumpy about it. But he says this, and I'll just translate one word, hominidae means the new apes. He says this, between the new hominidae and us who are dying, already there rises a barrier across which no voice can ever carry, for devils are unmaking language. We must let that alone forever. Uproot your loves one by one with care from the future, and trusting to no future, receive the massive thrust and surge of the many-dimensional timeless rays converging on this small, significant dewdrop, the present that mirrors all. And this could be Ransom's dilemma and Ransom's thought in his head right now. That this moment is the key moment and contains all moments in all worlds.
Well, after this, gentleman, Maleldil then sends the unman into a deep sleep and tells Ransom to walk 20 paces into the wood and sleep before we all take a well-deserved, nap, I wish, starting today. Is there anything either of you would like to share?
When I realized again that this chapter was just a huge setup for what happens next, but it's an important one. And I think it's got great personal applications, especially as we start a new year, especially for those who are making any kinds of resolutions or trying to think about new patterns and new thoughts.
Yeah, it's a very disruptive chapter in some otherwise pious thoughts that I would be thinking otherwise. to realize that my contribution is real, but also that Maleldil is inviting me to participate in salvation history. That is humbling. And, what's he trying to do? Is he trying to lose worlds? Why choose me?
But maybe like with Bree, the horse, maybe we can go a little faster and do a little bit more, and we'll never know unless we try.
And Maleldil might send lions after us, so try hard.
Yes.
Well, gentlemen, I hear the call for final drinks. So thank you to our intern, Julia, and our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah. Thank you to our Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Jody, Robert, Mark, Mary Margaret, Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Megan, Brian, Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, Kay, Belly, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joelle, Erica, Matt, James, Bud 2, Bud 1, Edgar, Aldo, Kevin, and Mark. And of course, to all of you guys listening and all of the wonderful reviews and feedback you guys have given. We've gotten so many ratings and reviews. It's been wonderful.
Please join us next time
when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.